This is True Spies, the podcast that takes you deep inside the greatest secret missions of all time. Week by week, you'll hear the true stories behind the operations that have shaped the world we live in. You'll meet the people who live life undercover. What do they know? What are their skills? And what would you do in their position? I'm Rhiannon Needs, and this is True Spies from SPYSCAPE Studios. It's 1969, a warm September evening in New York City.
Jane Alpert and Sam Melville are settled on top of their roof in their Lower East Side building looking downtown.
This young couple may not have much, but they've got this view, the stuff memories are made of.
And they, with their own eyes, see the bomb explode and see the lights in the entire federal building blink out.
Their eyes widen, jaws drop. Their city is under attack, and they couldn't be happier.
So they are witness to their own bombing from a few miles away. This is the seat of the federal government in New York City for all intents and purposes, and they had just shut it down over a night.
Yes, this is New York City, but not as you know it. Because this is a city that lives and works beneath the shadow of the bomb. Well, bombs, plural.
From radical left-wing bombers to radical right-wing bombers to religious bombers to secular bombers to bombers who are engaging in violence for causes foreign as well as purely domestic.
Your guide to these troubled streets?
My name is David Viola. I am a historian and a professor at John Jay College in New York City. I am also a military intelligence officer with the U.S. Navy, and my first book, You Have Unleashed a Storm, was published by HarperCollins earlier in 2025, and it is a narrative history of sort of this forgotten era of terrorism, historic era of terrorism in New York City in the 1960s and in the 1970s that saw New York City being the venue for, sheer volume-wise, the most incidents of terrorism probably in modern history by the widest variety of actors engaging in terrorism.
David Viola's fascination with the violence that has plagued his city runs deep.
I grew up in New York City, and the 1993 World Trade Center bombing is one of my first experiences of that kind of fright that terrorism can descend on a society. And just out of university in 2001, I worked just a few blocks away from the World Trade Center on September 11th. And my brother is a career fireman with FDNY. So terrorism has always been one of the colors painting the kaleidoscope that's been my life, unfortunately.
But given his resume, it won't surprise you to learn that he's also taken a particular interest in the intelligence response to terror in New York.
NYPD had been involved in political intelligence going back to the turn of the 20th century, since before the FBI even existed.
You might have already heard David's subscriber-only interview on the subject of the first Red Scare, a wave of anarchist bombings that swept America in the 1910s and 1920s. And by the late 1960s, a specialist political intelligence unit called the Bureau of Special Services and Investigations, BOSSI for short, was responsible for monitoring and infiltrating subversive groups in the Big Apple. But this isn't their story.
By 1969, BOSSI had kind of been running into some hot water. They had been involved in some incidents like the arrest of the Black Panthers in New York that really was becoming very politically caustic for them. And, BOSSI was trying to recede back to the background.
But rest assured, you're about to enter a world of violence, intrigue, and radical politics all of its own. It's time to meet the Melville Collective. We met Sam Melville and Jane Alpert as they gazed over the New York skyline, waiting for carnage to unfold in the fall of '69. So, who are they?
Sam Melville is 34 years old in 1969, making him a decade or more older than many or most of the activists who were engaging in left-wing protests in New York City and throughout the nation.
Before the bombs, before Jane, Sam Melville was comfortable. He had a family and a steady job. His father had been a staunch American communist of the classic Workers Unite stripe. But during the turbulent 1960s, his own politics took on a wider, more radical scope.
More of this new left philosophy of catch-all anti-Vietnam, gay rights, civil rights approach to activism. And in the late 60s, as he becomes more and more aware of everything that's happening in the world and around him, gives up this burgeoning career as a plumbing engineer, gives up a wife and a young child on the Upper West Side, and just walks away from it all.
Melville earned his stripes in the spring of 1968 during a wave of anti-war protests at Columbia University.
This is within blocks of where Sam Melville and his family live, and Sam Melville gets right on the front lines as these protests get really ugly and confrontations with the police escalate. He's rolling up his sleeves and kind of earning his bona fides and earning his chops as part of the movement right there in April 68, and he never looks back.
It was in this fiery crucible that Melville met the love of his life. Jane Alpert was a graduate student at Columbia in her early 20s.
She's working at a very prominent university academic press at the time. She's a local of Forest Hills, Queens.
So, a respectable job in publishing and a leafy neighborhood. Not exactly the kind of background you'd associate with a mass bomber. And together, Sam and Jane were about to turn the page on a new chapter.
Their relationship really takes off quickly, and they move down to the Lower East Side of Manhattan. This is a hub of activity for the Black Panther Party. This is a hub of activity for the Young Lords Party. This is where left-wing radicalism and left-wing press is all centered. So they really move to the heart of it together.
To Sam and Jane, the Lower East Side was a kind of ideological frontier town, a place where world-changing thoughts could be born. There, the couple became a part of New York's radical melting pot.
Jane Alpert was a pretty committed activist on the left, but she didn't have an arrest record. She had never been bloodied at a protest or anything like this.
Sam Melville did and had. And in the spring of 1969, when she returned from a business trip to England, she found that her older lover had made an executive decision.
She finds that Sam had invited two fugitive Canadian bombers into her home, into their home. It's something of a surprise.
Being a generally open-minded sort of person, Jane soon warmed to her unexpected houseguests, not least because they came with the whiff of revolution on their heels.
The two Canadian fugitives were Jean-Pierre Charette, at the time 25 years old, and Alain Ayard, who was just 22 at the time, and they had been involved in some significant bombings in Canada.
Both Charette and Ayard were members of the Front de Libération de Québec, or the FLQ, a French-speaking Québécois separatist group who had been waging a bombing campaign in Canada since 1963. Now, they were south of the border and being sheltered by the tight-knit community of leftists on the Lower East Side. The ideas they shared, unsurprisingly, had a radicalizing effect, most notably on Jane.
Through the course of them giving shelter to these two individuals, she really sort of invests in the movement. She eventually quits her quote-unquote straight job. She takes a job at Rat Subterranean News, which is one of the most radical left-wing publications in the country at the time, which is just a few blocks from their home in the Lower East Side. And then she and Sam and the like-minded individuals who were surrounding them, helped plan the escape of these Canadian fugitives from the United States by helping them plan a hijacking, which was pretty in vogue at the time.
It might surprise you to know that in the late 60s, aeroplane hijackings were incredibly common. That's because, unlike today, they were pretty easy to pull off. Sam, Jane, and their friends secured false papers for the FLQ fugitives from Canada. They bought them a gun. They even drove them to the airport. And then,
to do all the logistics for these two Canadian fugitives from the FLQ to then hijack a plane successfully and find their way to Cuba, find their way to Havana, which is where people like that very often took refuge.
A happy ending then, depending, of course, on your point of view. And although Charette and Ayad had been, by anyone's standards, demanding house guests, the relationship hadn't all gone one way.
These Canadian fugitives from the FLQ, they really become important in the history of Sam Melville and Jane Alpert, and maybe in radical left bombings in the United States more broadly, by helping to transfer their knowledge. The FLQ had learned a lot about bombings, about dynamite, about how to secure dynamite, about how to transport and store it safely, and very importantly, how to build time bombs using dynamite and simple alarm clocks. They leave New York with a very, very capable and very dedicated student in Sam Melville. They leave behind left-wing bombers in New York City when they escape to Havana.
That summer, Sam, Jane, and a small inner circle decided to follow in the Canadians' footsteps and take their activism to the next level. They had come to believe that violence was the only way to get noticed and effect change. And it wasn't long before they put that belief into practice.
On July 27th, 1969, Melville, Alpert, and at least one other bomber descend on Pier 3 in Lower Manhattan, a pier that they knew to be involved in United Fruit's commerce.
United Fruit? We'll let David explain.
United Fruit is one of these American massive corporations that's kind of disappeared in history. But in the 1960s, United Fruit is among the most loathed corporations by the left for United Fruit's involvement in helping to support dictators and authoritarian regimes in Latin and South America, all in the name of fruit commerce. It's United Fruit that really makes the banana one of the most eaten food products in the entire world. This is where we get the term Banana Republic from these regimes that have been supported by, United Fruit and at least to a small degree by the CIA.
That's right. In the 1960s, even the produce was political, which explains why Sam Melville and Jane Alpert had chosen this pier for their maiden bombing.
The pier is just a few blocks away from the massive construction site that will very soon become the World Trade Center. They take a time device that they had learned how to build, and they pretty effectively, blow up a couple of doors, but really do no other damage other than really damaging the pier itself and a couple of big steel doors.
Okay, it's not much, but it's a start, right?
Unfortunately, they had completely missed the fact that United Fruit was no longer using the pier, but it was leasing it out at the time.
Consequently, the NYPD had no idea as to why anyone might have taken the time to blow it up in the first place.
This is also a really busy time in New York City and in the world. The Apollo 11 mission had just landed men on the moon 6 days earlier. The police raid at the Stonewall Inn, starting the modern gay rights movement, was just a few weeks before that. So, successful bombing, but completely unsuccessful in making anyone hear what was happening.
The Melville Collective had even circulated a communique to the city's radical papers, including the Rat subterranean press where Jane worked.
But other than the small readership within the radical community that was kind of already paying attention to these events, nobody else knew that this happened.
The whole episode was met with an overwhelming shrug. So much for direct action. But Sam, Jane, and their inner circle weren't to be deterred. As the summer of 1969 wore on, they became ever more closely entwined with America's radical community. And where better to find it than the Woodstock Music and Arts Fair, billed as 3 days of peace in upstate New York. We tend to remember it for the music, Hendrix, Joplin, etc. But politics were woven into the fabric of the event.
There was one section of Woodstock that was called Movement City that had these, tents and tables set up by various aspects of the movement. At one of these tables, Sam runs into one of the activists there that he had, seen around the movement once or twice, perhaps knew by name, perhaps knew by face.
And if you'd met this activist once, you wouldn't forget him in a hurry.
He was, a small figure, but he was a little bit older than most other activists, but was always recognizable because he would always be flying around town in this shiny purple cape with an American football helmet with big plumes on the top of it.
His name was George Demily. Crazy George Demily to his friends.
And he's always talking about bombings or other really off-the-kilter things, which is what got him the name Crazy George.
Wacky headgear aside, George Demily was a serious player on the radical left. He'd earned his stripes alongside Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin, founders of the Youth International Party, the Yippies. In Chicago, during the mass protests around the Democratic National Convention of 1968, he'd been pepper-sprayed, and a gun had been held to his head.
He was right at the center of things.
But even with such luminaries of the movement in attendance, Sam Melville hadn't been sold on Woodstock.
Sam didn't have a particularly good time. He thought it was a little bit mindless.
The drugs, the dirt, the late-night proselytizing. It all lacked focus. And Melville would tolerate no distractions from his cause. The collective's next target was already lined up.
Just a few days after they returned from Woodstock, Sam Melville and Jane Alpert, back now on the Lower East Side, are walking up to a phone booth in the middle of the night when there are still phone booths on every corner in New York City. And they make a hurried call to the security desk at the Marine Midland Bank in Lower Manhattan. And when they get on the phone with the security desk, they warn them that there's a bomb in the building and it's going to go off soon.
A bomb? Oh, sure.
And their warning call is seen as a joke and they're hung up on. Before too long, a pretty massive bomb of about 24 sticks of dynamite, which is a powerful bomb, goes off at one of the top floors of the Marine Midland Bank. But what Sam Melville and Jane Alpert didn't really know was that these banks often have 24-hour shifts in order to close all the accounts and tally all the accounts from the day. So there's more than 100 people still working in the building.
Miraculously, nobody dies.
There was this massive 2-ton accounting machine between all these individuals and the bomb.
But more than a dozen are injured. This was no piddling attack on an empty pier. This was real.
After the Marine Midland bombing, many individuals who were involved with the collective are really, one, upset and frightened by the fact that they had caused injuries. According to their own telling of their history, that was not the intent of anyone, which is why they had been placing bombs very late at night in places where they thought nobody was. There are people who leave the collective after the Marine Midland bombing, and there are other people who demand that they're much more fastidious in their avoidance of hurting anyone.
Nonetheless, the Melville Collective gets what it wants: attention. Deputy Chief Inspector Albert Seidman is a cop's cop. With his pearl-handled revolver and cigar-chomping grimace, he might have walked out of a gangster movie. But the tough exterior belies an uncanny knack for solving the cases that no one else can. But in the aftermath of the Marine Midland Bank bombing, even he doesn't find much to go on.
The cops do find what Albert Seidman claims is literally barrels of evidence. There's wire from the device. They had found parts of the alarm clock, but it happened to be the most popular alarm clock in the United States at the time, so that's not a super helpful lead. Albert Seidman and his detectives do discover, though, that Explo Industries, which was the only firm in New York City up in the Bronx that was contracted to sell dynamite for demolition and construction and other purposes, had been robbed earlier in July of nearly 200 sticks of dynamite and 100 blasting caps, which is a lot of dynamite and a lot of blasting caps. They put 2 and 2 together, and they have a pretty good suspicion that whoever had conducted that robbery was involved in these bombings.
But the robbers were wearing masks and got away clean. Seidman's investigation has hit another frustrating dead end. So Seidman and his team cast the net wider.
NYPD does eventually, though, catch wind of some communiques from the bombers that had been printed in Rat Subterranean News, where Jane Alpert works.
Seidman and his detectives decide to pay the Radical newspaper a visit at its offices on the Lower East Side.
While Jane Alpert is actually at work. They have no clue that Jane Alpert herself is involved, but they have a pretty good suspicion that someone at Rat knows something, because they just don't believe that these communiques had found their way to the Rat without any other involvement.
A promising lead, but not hard evidence, not by a long way. For now, the Melville Collective were free to continue their campaign of terror on the streets of New York.
On September 19th of 1969, in the middle of the day, Jane Alpert gets off of a bus dressed in a nice skirt and gloves on her hands and a purse that she had recently stolen from a department store slung over her shoulder, and walks into the Federal Building at 26 Federal Plaza in Foley Square in downtown Manhattan. The Federal Building at 26 Federal Plaza also houses virtually all of the federal government offices in New York City, including offices for the FBI and including offices for the Department of Defense and the U.S. Army on some of the top floors.
The building is right across the street from the courts in which members of the Black Panther Party are being tried on various charges, including criminal conspiracy and murder. Left-wing protesters throng the streets outside, and among that raucous, long-haired crowd, nobody suspects this smartly dressed young woman of anything untoward.
And Jane Alpert proceeds to walk into the building at 26 Federal Plaza, which houses all these government offices, and proceeds to find her way to one of the top floors, where she deposits another enormous dynamite bomb of about 24 sticks of dynamite before joining the crowds and finding her way out of the building.
Tick-tock.
And later that evening, Jane Alpert and Sam Melville are settled on top of their roof in their Lower East Side building looking downtown.
You know what happens next.
I think the word that Jane Alpert used when she described it was elated. Also, some degree of disbelief that they'd actually been able to pull it off.
The Melville Collective had struck at the heart of the federal government in New York City. In doing so, they'd upped the stakes significantly. Now, the full force of that government would come down on their heads.
John Malone, often referred to as Cement Head by his colleagues and subordinates, was the assistant director in charge of the New York office of the FBI at the time. And when the federal building is bombed by Jane Alpert and Sam Melville and the rest of the collective, this becomes their number one priority. John Malone and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover put pretty much the FBI's number one investigator, Joseph Sullivan, on the case, and they bring together a collection of FBI special agents from different departments in the New York office to join what they call the bomb squad to look into the bombers and find them.
It wasn't long before the FBI turned up at Sam Melville's doorstep.
Like many other activists in New York, Sam Melville had already been on the FBI's radar prior to the bombings at the Marine Midland Bank and certainly of the Federal Building.
But why?
In the course of their support for the FLQ bombers who they had helped to escape to Havana, Jane Alpert and Sam Melville had traveled to Canada on more than one occasion to help try and get them forged documents, etc., etc. And in the course of those travels, Melville had been arrested once, and they're starting to make their way onto the radar as activists who are, moving in between New York and Canada and possibly engaging in relations with Canadian and Quebecois separatist radicals.
Sam and Jane's earlier generosity towards their Canadian house guests might just have come back to bite them.
So they're already being investigated, but kind of everyone's already being investigated if you're a left-wing activist in New York.
Ah. So there's still nothing concrete linking Sam and Jane to these bombings. The FBI are just ticking names off their long list of leftist radicals.
So FBI agents actually find their way to Sam Melville and Jane Alpert's apartment on the Lower East Side to talk to him about his activities up on the northern border with Canada. They come face to face with Sam Melville, but Sam Melville is not Sam Melville.
Cryptic, no? Well, not really. Sam just gives the FBI a fake name, David McCurdy.
David McCurdy was actually an anthropology professor somewhere in the Midwest. But FBI agents have met him, even though they don't know that they've met him, and they have been to his apartment.
For now, this simple ruse is enough to keep the FBI off his tail. But steps have to be taken to ensure that they don't come sniffing around again.
So, after the NYPD's visit to Rat Subterranean News that kind of spooked Jane Alpert and everyone else, and in combination with the FBI's visit to their Lower East Side apartment, kind of puts them on edge a little bit. They know that they are pretty close to the microscope at this point.
So the Melville Collective lawyers up. Their attorney informs the Bureau that his clients will not be speaking to them.
The FBI kind of backs off at this point because there's really nothing to charge Sam or Jane with at the time. But even though the FBI backs off, they have collected information and intelligence on both Jane and Sam that will come into play later on.
And despite the extra scrutiny, the bombings continue. And not just in New York.
Days, not even a week after the bombing at the federal building, Sam Melville is now in the Midwest on kind of a bombing road trip. And within the span of 2 days, 3 different bombs are either exploded or found before they detonate.
Chicago, Madison, Milwaukee. The collective is expanding the scale of its operations.
The Melville Collective probably involves a dozen people. Really, Sam Melville and Jane Alpert and another young couple by the name of Dave Huey and Pat Swinton. They are the core of this bombing collective. The bombing collective in New York City has, at a minimum, 5 or 6 other bombers or accomplices who have been themselves engaged in other aspects of bombing.
And on the 10th of November, 1969, they pull off their most audacious attack yet.
So in one 24-hour period, the Melville Collective, who at this point have really kind of honed their practice in terms of building bombs, attacks 3 different locations throughout New York City: the offices of Standard Oil, the offices of General Motors, and the offices of the Chase Manhattan Bank, all in Manhattan.
Companies that, to the collective, symbolize America's corporate hegemony.
These are massive bombs that cause a ton of destruction at the places where they are detonated, even though they don't result in any significant injury at all.
Again, nobody dies. But when the bombs go off, the nation is watching.
This is front page news. The bombings and the bombers are now getting the attention that, they failed to get even just as recently as July when they bombed the pier on the Hudson River. They are getting on the front page of the news. Their communiques that detail their issues are making it into local papers like the Daily News. They're making it into nationwide papers like the New York Times. They're getting the attention that they sought. The public is frightened and the public is hearing what they're saying.
The FBI and the NYPD look on, aghast. Once again, they've been powerless to stop the assault on the city.
The NYPD is on edge. They're doubling down on their investigation, and Albert Seidman is continuing to be at the center of it. Seidman calls his friend John Malone at the FBI.
There's still smoke in the air over Manhattan. But what Malone says to Seidman is about to turn the Deputy Chief Inspector's trademark grimace into a beam of relief.
It's just the best news that Seidman has heard in a long time. What he said to him is that it took a while, but our informant finally gave up our man.
Three months earlier, George Demily looked out from his stall at Woodstock's Movement City. As they spoke, his hooded eyes took in the couple opposite. The man was just a few years younger than he was, with dark, receding hair. The woman was younger still, but no less intense in her conviction. As far as anyone there knew, all 3 were on the same side. Anyone but George Demily.
George Demily is 39 years old by 1969 and had lived up until that point a pretty interesting life, if not a life full of successes. He had spent his early years in a succession of orphanages and working at aimless jobs, working at least for some time on a Danish tramp ship, spending some time in psychiatric care, and was also in the Air Force for a short time before he went AWOL, was arrested, and then dishonorably discharged.
As they had for Sam Melville, the 1960s had sparked a flame in the directionless George Demily.
George Demily had picked up pretty radical right-wing ideology.
He had been part of the fiercely anti-communist John Birch Society, as well as the Minutemen, a radical right-wing organization with violent ambitions of its own.
Demily had not been indicted, but had been subpoenaed by the grand jury on 2 different occasions as NYPD investigated a widespread Minutemen bombing plot in the mid-1960s in New York City.
But Demily had his own ideas about how to deal with his counterparts on the far left.
So in August of 1966, George Demily literally walks into the FBI offices in New York City and sits down with FBI Special Agent John Robinson. He offers his services to infiltrate not the radical right wing, but rather to be somehow an FBI plant in the left-wing movement happening around New York City.
Now, obviously, a known right-wing radical would not be the FBI's first choice for a mole inside the left.
But the FBI had such a voracious appetite for any kind of information or intelligence on anything that was left-wing in New York City and throughout the nation that they take him at his suggestion and start working to get him into the field.
Now, it's important to note that the FBI weren't paying Demily at this point. The federal government couldn't be seen to be actively employing someone with his unstable past. But luckily for them, he wasn't in it for the money.
At the suggestion, but not the direction, of the FBI agent who he first meets with, Demily volunteers on the campaign for Congress of a Brooklyn communist. And that's kind of his first entree into the world of leftist politics and leftist activism in New York City.
Before long, George Demily had become a well-known face on the New York leftist scene.
And eventually finds his way to the Yippie movement, to Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin's Yippie movement, which was, at the time, one of the leading movements for all leftist activism in all of the United States, and they are centered in New York City.
As it turned out, this untrained volunteer had a natural gift for undercover work. Like many of the professional spies and infiltrators we've profiled on this series, he crafted a persona and committed to it. Hard.
There's always like an eye being kept out for police informants, but Demily's kind of so off-kilter that he really doesn't stand out that much. He creates this very visual persona with his flowing purple cape behind him and his football helmet with plumes rising out of the top of it. And he's also getting in bed with some of the most respected activists in all of New York City. He's a close confidant of the Black Panther Party. He's a close confidant of Abbie Hoffman, who is as respected as anyone in the leftist movement throughout the United States. He's very effective at building out this left-wing persona, this crazy George persona, in just a few years.
He walked the walk and talked the talk.
He is as radical as anyone when he's talking about activism and violence. He's suggesting to blow up the Brooklyn Bridge. He's dressing up as a dead Green Beret. And, activists kind of always assumed that he had come from some other organization within the movement that was just not their own, just like everybody else did.
Getting pepper sprayed and arrested at the 1968 Democratic National Convention had only bolstered his bona fides, even if some people did think he'd been released from custody suspiciously quickly. But to Sam Melville, at least, Demily's credentials seemed unimpeachable.
So on Friday of November 7th, George Demily, in his apartment in the Lower East Side, receives a phone call, and when he picks it up, the person on the other end simply introduces themselves as a friend. And the person on the other line asked Demily to meet the following day on the corner of 1st Street and 1st Avenue, just down the corner from Demily's home. Demerly, of course, through his engagement with the FBI as an undercover informant and through his time in the radical left-wing movement, was pretty familiar at this point with clandestine and subterfuge. So, agrees to it. And when he shows up the following day, he finds Sam Melville there waiting for him.
So why has Sam Melville chosen to reach out to Demerly, of all people? Well, word on the scene has it that he and Crazy George might have a common interest.
He has an understanding that George himself had been involved in a number of radical actions, including perhaps some bombings.
In truth, George Demerly hasn't done anything of the sort.
But Demerly's not going to disabuse Melville of that belief.
So George goes with it, establishes trust, and then Sam starts talking.
Melville then also admits to his own involvement in this series of bombings over the previous months in New York City. And he also has an offer for Demerly. He wants Demerly to join the collective. He wants Demerly to become involved in this bombing campaign.
Naturally, once the conversation is over, Demerly hightails it to his FBI handler to spill the beans. He identifies a photograph of Melville, the man the FBI have already met once this year, using the name David McCurdy. But the authorities only have Demerly's word to go on. They do find an address on the Lower East Side, registered to Melville's alias. Surveillance teams witness members of the collective coming and going, sometimes carrying large, mysterious packages. But there's nothing actionable. Not yet. On November 10th, 3 more bombs tear through Manhattan.
The FBI is pretty certain at this point that their informant has got good information. He had provided information prior to the bombings that they were going to happen, so they know that they have their sights on the right guy.
Now, they need to catch the Melville Collective in the act of actually planting an explosive. And they won't have to wait long.
Sam Melville calls George Demerly again just a day following the triple bombings in New York City. The smoke hasn't even really cleared yet. Police are still processing the scenes. And this is now Melville's invitation to Demerly to help him build bombs and engage in another bombing to immediately follow up that triple bombing.
On the afternoon of November 12th, Sam and George meet again.
They go for a beer, they catch up, and then they make their way back to an apartment that Sam had been using as kind of a bomb factory just around the corner from George Demerly's Lower East Side apartment to get to work building bombs.
As they tape sticks of dynamite into those devastating bundles and tinker with alarm clocks, the two radicals discuss the order of the day. Their next target will be the 69th Regiment Armory of the National Guard. There's no time to waste.
George Demerly and Sam Melville walk out of this apartment on the Lower East Side with duffel bags full of dynamite.
George Demerly scans the street. He sees what Sam doesn't.
There are FBI and NYPD eyes all over the place. They are in costume, dressed up as Harley-Davidson bikers. They are on the rooftops. They are sitting in cafes. They are sitting in businesses with darkened windows and scratched out peepholes watching them at all times, following Sam as he takes the subway, and also on the streets in beat-up old cars used for cover. And when Sam Melville and George Demerly find their way to the 69th Regiment Armory on Lexington Avenue, right near Union Square in New York, there are literally FBI agents on top of the armory looking down on them, and there are NYPD detectives on the streets walking around everywhere.
It's like a movie set, teeming with extras. And the star has no idea that it's time for his close-up.
There are NYPD detectives walking around, out of uniform, of course, and Sam Melville sets his sights on some big army trucks, on big army troop transport trucks.
The kind of vehicle that had, in recent years, ferried National Guardsmen to quell left-wing protests across the USA. A symbolic target, but doomed all the same.
He and Demerly check to make sure that the doors are open, and then just as they are about to place the bombs, they are absolutely pounced upon. NYPD detectives and FBI agents come from everywhere and descend on the men, and they're immediately tossed to the ground and tossed up against walls.
In the end, the biggest factor in Melville's downfall is one dedicated informant. One who, until very recently, hadn't even drawn a paycheck for his undercover efforts. His contacts within America's radical left are almost without equal. So the government wants to keep him in play.
So when this huge crowd of FBI special agents and NYPD detectives arrest Sam Melville, they also toss George Demerly in a car and arrest him. They're trying to maintain his cover because they want to squeeze as much out of this informant as they can. He has been so useful up until this point that they would really love to not burn him if at all possible. So Sam Melville goes to jail. George Demerly goes to a briefing room at the FBI headquarters on the Upper East Side and gets congratulations from his handler before also being sent to jail so he can maintain his cover.
But Sam Melville isn't stupid. He knows there's only one person who could have made this happen.
Instead of feeding him more information on perhaps who else is involved in the conspiracy, Sam Melville instead offers to give George Demerly a beating when he finds him in jail.
Demerly is blown, but the damage he's dealt to the Melville Collective is done.
Almost immediately following Sam Melville and George Demerly's arrest near the Armory near Union Square, FBI special agents and NYPD detectives descend on the Lower East Side building where Melville and Jane Alpert lived alongside, in a separate apartment, David Huey and Pat Swinton. They almost break down the door before Jane Alpert opens it. Jane and David Huey, who is in the apartment with her, are both arrested. Pat Swinton, lucky for her, happened to not be in the building at the time, and she proceeded to go on the run underground and was not caught up with until 1975.
Jane Alpert, Melville's partner, romantically and criminally, pled guilty to conspiracy before skipping bail and going on the run. She finally surrendered in 1974 and spent more than 30 months in prison for her role in the bombings. Meanwhile, the trial of Sam Melville becomes a cause célèbre for the radical left.
Kind of like the Black Panther case was just the year prior. And ultimately, Sam Melville takes a plea and finds his way to the Attica Correctional Facility in upstate New York.
Now, if you're of a certain vintage, or a fan of classic 70s cinema, that name might ring a bell.
This is in the context of the prisoner rights movement in the United States, in the face of pretty dire conditions in prisons throughout the United States. And in September of 1971, upwards of 1,000 inmates at Attica engage in this uprising, this violent uprising, and take control of the entire prison. And Sam is right there on the ramparts of this uprising.
On the morning of September 13th, 1971, tear gas streamed over the fortified walls of Attica.
At the direction of Governor Nelson Rockefeller, the authorities violently retake the prison, and unfortunately 33 inmates and 10 hostages are killed in the retaking. Sam Melville is among the dead that day at Attica, killed by a state trooper's shotgun blast to the chest as he was nearby a bunker filled with Molotov cocktails that had never actually been used. He was 36 years old.
And George Demerly? With his cover in tatters, his days as an undercover leftist were over. And you might have expected this fervent anti-communist to return to his previous affiliations on the far right. But his years on the Lower East Side had left their mark. And in the end, it's unclear as to how much space really existed between the man and the persona.
Even in the wake of the arrest and George Demerly's outing as an FBI informant, he admitted that he appreciated some of the aspects of the left-wing community that he had been exposed to. You know, he wouldn't necessarily articulate what those were, but George Demerly, he appreciated smoking pot and hanging out with younger women. And even later in life, he was still attending anti-war rallies, even in the wake of the American invasion of Iraq.
For David, the violent history of the Melville Collective and its downfall is a story of two unique personalities.
I think that Sam Melville and George Demily in the final accounting have much more in common than either one of them would have ever admitted at the time. These are both men who found their way to the causes that define their lives later in life after having lived, kind of mundane blue-collar lives up until the point. They're also both people that kind of fell outside of the lines of the general stream of their movements. Virtually all of leftist activism in the United States was engaged in peacefully. Sam Melville was not going to be that guy. And virtually all of right-wing activism in the United States at the same time was engaged in right-wing activism and not infiltrating the left and sort of adopting parts of the left like Demily did. So these are both guys who, while they sit squarely in the movements that define them, neither one of them is cliche and neither one of them is a carbon copy of anyone else in that movement.
For more detail on this story, and more narratives from this turbulent, half-remembered period of American history, we'd recommend picking up a copy of David's book, You Have Unleashed a Storm. And to commemorate the 300th week of True Spies run, SPYSCAPE Plus subscribers should keep an eye out for another bonus minisode, all about the plot to bring down the USA's most iconic landmark. But for now, thanks for listening. And we'll be back next time with another clandestine rendezvous with True Spies. Disclaimer. The views expressed in this podcast are those of the subject. These stories are told from their perspective, and their authenticity should be assessed on a case-by-case basis. If you're enjoying this podcast, please click now to give it a 5-star rating or leave a review. Ratings and reviews help people discover the podcast and help us bring you more great stories. And if you have some time, why not forward the podcast to a friend?